Hi, this is Ryan Hoger with HVAC Solutions. This week's webinar is on system sensor duct smoke detectors. I'm going to go ahead and begin it now, and I'm going to start a little bit regarding some of the codes that are applicable here, and then I'm going to go ahead and talk about the actual product line itself. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. All right, so what are the codes that are involved here? There's two primary codes that come up quite a bit. One is National Fire Protection Association Standard 90A. The other one is the International Mechanical Code, either 2006 or 2009, depending on what your community is following. There are also many local fire and mechanical codes that come into play, but we're going to concentrate on NFPA and IMC. NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, IMC, International Mechanical Code. Those are the two that are going to be required most often, and sometimes both, as you'll see. All right, so the purpose of a duct smoke detector is to obviously sense the presence of smoke in the duct, and his job in life is to prevent injury, panic amongst the people, and obviously not propagate further property damage from the smoke by spreading it from one area to another. So his job is to stop the spread of smoke. All right, so what does a duct detector not do? It is not a substitute for area smoke detectors in the actual space. So some people like to think that, oh, instead of providing whatever 40 smoke detectors in this office building, if I put a duct smoke detector in, I don't have to put them in the office building. That is not true. The duct detector is supplemental to that system if that system is required. All right. So, and it's also not a replacement for any fire life safety systems like sprinkler systems or anything like that. His job in life is just to sense the presence of smoke in the duct and stop spreading that smoke. That's all he does. Okay, so obviously a duct smoke detector being mounted in the duct only works when the fan is running. If the fan is off, like at nighttime, we often shut our air handlers down. It'll take a long time for smoke to get from the space into the duct and over to the detector. So that's another reason why we don't want to use it in place of the normal systems, because it'll take a long time when the air handler is off. So it's got to be running in order to sense that. And in a commercial building, we always have the fan and the air handler running during occupied hours for code reasons anyway. So it works good for that case. But it does not take the place of the smoke detectors in the actual space itself. Obviously, the dirtier the air system, the more ineffective a duct smoke detector can be. So it's very good advice, as well for other reasons, to keep your filter system clean. All right, so NFPA, National Fire Protection Association Standard 90A, requires that if you have units that are above 2,000 CFM, you have to install a duct smoke detector in the supply air duct. Okay? Supply air duct over 2,000 CFM required. Additionally, if you got a unit that's more than 15,000 CFM and is serving more than one floor of the building, so you got a 50-ton rooftop providing air conditioning to 2 or 3 floors, then you have to have a duct detector mounted in the return duct at each story before it goes into the common return riser. So if you had a 50-ton rooftop serving 2 floors, you'd have 3 detectors. 1 in the return duct for each floor, and then 1 in the main supply duct. Okay? You have to do this even if you don't have to provide a fire alarm system under NFPA. Many types of buildings do not require a full fire alarm system, but that does not preclude you from the requirement of having a duct smoke detector. International Mechanical Code, or as I'm going to call it, IMC, also requires that if you have over 2,000 CFM, same as NFPA, both look at 2,000 CFM, then you have to have a duct detector. The difference here is that IMC requires it in the return air duct. NFPA requires it in the supply air duct. So that's the distinction. Additionally, on the IMC, if you have multiple air handlers sharing a common duct, and that common CFM is more than 2,000 CFM, then you also have to do it. So in this example, maybe you got 2 4-ton furnaces twinned together. Neither one of them is 2,000 CFM on his own, but together 2 4-ton furnaces would be 2,000 CFM. So you would have to have the detector in the return duct. Also on the International Mechanical Code, if you have 2 or more stories of a building, you're required to have a return smoke detector at each floor. This is the same as NFPA. They word it a little different. NFPA says more than 1 story. The IMC says 2 stories or more. It's the exact same thing. If you don't have 1 story, 2, 3, 5, then you have to do it. So that's 15,000 CFM, just like NFPA. So that requirement is the same every floor. If you have a community that's requiring you to follow NFPA and IMC both, then yes, you do have to put detectors in both the supply and the return duct systems if it's above 2,000 CFM rooftop or air handler. So we got some products here we'll talk to you about in a little bit that are going to help you do that quite easily. Additionally, if the duct detector is not powered by the fire alarm panel, which on smaller systems it typically is not, and his only job in life is to shut down the HVAC fan, and once again on smaller systems that's typically all he has to do, then you're not required to have a battery backup. That comes up every once in a while. Some authorities having jurisdiction have the false belief that NFPA requires a duct smoke detector for systems that are 2,000 CFM. That's not true. It has to be over 2,000 CFM. I realize it's only a 1 CFM distinction there, but a lot of air handlers are listed on schedules at 2,000 CFM. It's a very common size, obviously, 5-ton unit. So with that being said, yeah, if it's 2,000 CFM, you don't have to do it, but you're probably still going to get flagged by the inspector and have to deal with that. So if you're going to do a 5-ton unit, either provide a duct smoke detector or set it up so it only does 1,950 CFM or something like that. Duct smoke detectors are not always required to activate the building evacuation system. So if you have if you have space detectors in the space, those obviously alert the system, sound the horns, tell people to get out of there. The duct detector doesn't always have to integrate to that. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, and we'll talk about that. All right, so if you don't have the requirement for a fire alarm system in your building, but you still have to put a duct detector in because it's more than 2,000 CFM, you may be required to have an audible and visual alarm in the actual space. Doesn't mean you have to have it in every single space, and doesn't mean you have to have all the pole stations and all that stuff. You don't have to have a full fire alarm system, but you have to have something in the space that makes a visual indication like a strobe light and an audible indication like a horn to let people know in that space that there is an issue. Duct detectors used to shut down HVAC units or shut down smoke dampers shall not be required to activate the building evacuation system. So it doesn't have to necessarily tie into that system. Unless you have a fire alarm system that is required. So if you have to have a fire alarm system because of code, if it's requiring you to do it in NFPA, then you have to have the duct smoke detectors wired to that system. If you don't have to have it because of code and you're just putting it in because you want to, then you don't have to necessarily integrate the two together. So you don't always have to have the duct detectors tied into the fire alarm system. In fact, most systems, the duct detectors are standalone. But there are some types of buildings, specifically larger high-rise buildings, that NFPA requires you to have a fire alarm system, and then it goes ahead and requires you to integrate it to the duct smoke detectors. You have to put these detectors downstream of any branch takeoffs if you're putting it in the supply air, and after any final filters. So if you're putting it in a rooftop unit and that rooftop unit's going to have some field HEPA filters on the discharge of it, you wouldn't be able to factory install it in the rooftop. You're going to have to go put it discharge downstream of the air filters. All right, if you have a multiple story building with that 15,000 CFM that we talked about, basically you have to put the detector on that floor, on the return for that floor only, before that return mixes in with the common return from other floors. So basically we want it to detect that air only, not the mixture of that zone and other zones. So hopefully that makes sense there as well. A few more code-related things, and then we'll talk about product. When the entire space is served by the air distribution system, I should clarify what I'm talking about here. NFPA 90A does not require duct to smoke detectors in these situations. When the entire space is served by the air distribution system that is protected by area smoke detectors, so you have a complete system, you don't necessarily have to have duct detectors as well, although oftentimes engineers will put them in. It's a good, inexpensive insurance policy. You don't have to have them when the fan units have a sole function of removing air from inside the building to the outside, so an exhaust-only system. So if you have a straight exhaust system, like bathroom exhaust for a common 10-floor building or something, one common exhaust system, it'll be over 2,000 CFM, but you don't need duct detectors because it's not going to spread smoke throughout the building. Okay? Only systems that are recirculated will require duct smoke detectors. And then, of course, there's engineered solutions that might give you the ability not to have them as well. Every duct smoke detector from every manufacturer has at least one set of contacts, typically called the auxiliary contacts, and he has one job in life. His job is to kill power to the fan motor. They're normally closed contacts, meaning that the power is being allowed through them. When the system alarms, because it senses smoke, those contacts open, which disables the power to the fan, shutting the fan down. Sometimes you'll have additional contacts on some smoke detectors to initiate remote alarm stations like strobes and horns, or to integrate to the fire life safety panel, or to interlock between different smoke detectors. You might have 3 or 4 of them on the same system. When one of them alarms, you may want all of them to alarm and shut off their associated air handlers. You can do that. So where to put these things? Typically, you're going to put them inside the building in the supply or return duct, depending on the code you're following. Typically, you want 6 duct diameters of straight duct upstream and downstream of the detector to ensure that you have good laminar flow. If you don't have good flow, you might have dead pockets, and the air may not actually be hitting the detector, which means any smoke in the system would not be hitting the detector. There's some loopholes around that, but we'll talk about that. You can mount them inside the building, which is preferred. You can mount them outside the building, like this drawing on the bottom shows, but that would be specifically for a weather-tight version of a smoke detector. So not every detector will do that. Just weather-tight versions, NEMA 4 rated. You can mount them inside the package units, inside a rooftop, and we'll talk about how you can do that. So the old NFPA required 6 duct diameters downstream. Now the new current NFPA 2007 version just says you have to get an adequate air sample. And the reason for that is you want to make sure you don't have your tube in places that are dead, like the corner of an elbow, or where they are stratified, like coming through a fan or something like that. The exception to that is any place that the manufacturer of a packaged equipment, if you're mounting it in the packaged equipment at the factory, says that you can, based on their measured pressure differential. You can also do it in the field that way. You can get a magnehelic gauge, and if you can measure pressure differential between 2 spots where the detector would go, both the intake and exhaust sampling tubes of the detector, then you can go ahead and put it there. But it's safest just to put it where you can get 6 duct diameters, if you can get that. If you're doing a smoke damper instead of equipment shutdown, obviously the detector needs to be on the upstream side of the damper itself to make sure we can sense that before the damper closes. All right, so now let's talk about the system sensor Innovair Flex product. The old system sensor product was called Innovair a few years back. Now it's called Innovair Flex, and it's because it's a flexible installation, and we'll show you that. Here's the different detectors that are available. The one on the top there is your typical detector. On the left side of it is the smoke head itself. On the right side is the control board and wiring relays. The middle detector, the white one, is the watertight NEMA 4 rated. This guy can go outside in ductwork. Obviously, you know, your conduit connections and stuff like that are going to need to be weather tight as well. But this is a way to get an outdoor detector. Obviously, it costs more than a regular one, but if you don't have any space inside the building to put it, this is an option. So if you got a horizontal discharge rooftop, this may be something you might want to look at. There's intelligent detectors, which means that you can use communication to communicate between different detectors to alarm each other, and also alarm back to a main panel. That is a proprietary thing, as with all manufacturers of smoke detectors, and this would be specific for the system sensor Honeywell type product. It wouldn't work with other parties. You can get 24 volt or 120 volt versions of these detectors. Like I said, there is a watertight version, the D4120W, W for watertight. It can be used indoor or outdoor. Typically outdoor because A, costs more money, and B, it's not clear so you can't see through it like you can on the indoor ones. The plastic is UV resistant, so it can be out in the sunlight, which is obviously important, and it has a wider range of temperature swings allowed than a typical detector. All right, so this is the right half side of that two-piece design of those detectors. The left side is the detector head itself. The right side is the control wiring. There are 3 different places you can bring conduit in, the top or the side. You can bring power in and control out of a separate one. And there are 3/4 inch conduit knockouts. These are backward compatible with the old Innovair line in terms of the accessories and in terms of how the terminations are labeled. So all the wiring terminals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on down the line, are labeled the same way on the old product and the new product. So if you're replacing one, it should be very easy to swap out. And then most of the accessories are compatible as well. The one thing that is not compatible is the sampling tubes. You would have to replace the sampling tube. This is one of the coolest aspects of this product here. Most of the time you buy a detector that looks like this. It's a rectangular shape. It fits where you put it. Everything's fine. Sometimes you have a tight constrained space and it doesn't fit, and then you got to go out and buy a different smoke detector to make it fit. Well, this one actually can field convert. You just take a screw out of the top, and then it flips over on this hinged access here into a square pattern, and then you put the screw back in. The wiring inside the hinge stays wired, so literally all you're doing is popping one screw out, flipping it, putting that screw back in, and now you can go ahead and mount this guy. So it does allow you some flexibility in terms of installation, hence the reason it's called Innovair Flex. The sampling tubes are also pretty convenient. They can be installed from the front or the back side of this guy. So this particular picture here shows us installing it through the detector. So the detector could already be mounted on the duct, and then I can go ahead and slide my sampling tube in. In this case, I'm showing a 1-foot sampling tube. Slide him right in, and he'll click into place. They're available in 1, 1.5, 3, 5, and 10-foot sections. 5 feet being the most common by far. The way to pick it is you have to pick one that's going to make it at least 80% of the way across the duct, and preferably 100%, but at least 80%. So if I had a 10-foot duct, I'd get a 10-foot tube. If I had an 8-foot duct, I would still buy a 10-foot tube, and then I would saw off the last 2 feet, so it made it through just the 8 feet of the duct. If I had a 6-foot duct, I could go ahead and get a 10-foot and cut 4 feet of it off, or I could buy a 5-foot and put it in, because it's going to make it about 80% of the way across the duct. So I have that flexibility choice. This shows the back side here. So like I said, you can install the tube from the front of the detector if the detector is already mounted on the duct, or you can install it from the back of the detector and then put the detector through the duct. You can also see here the front one here is the sampling tube. That's the long tube from 1 to 10 feet long with the sampling holes on it. The one in the middle of the detector is the discharge tube. That comes with the detector. It's like a 3-inch tube. It fits on there. The sampling tube you order separate because we don't know what length you need. The discharge tube is always 3 inches, and it comes with it. So the air comes in these holes in the front of the sampling tube, makes its way through the head of the detector, goes through, and then comes out the discharge tube back into the supply duct. So the reason I mention that is people sometimes confuse that little 3-inch discharge tube with a sampling tube and think that's all they need. You do not. You always have to order a sampling tube, always, for every manufacturer. These detector heads that are used are the exact same ones that System Sensor uses for their space detection products. So that helps out with manufacturing volume because there's a lot of stuff that goes in spaces, obviously. And it also makes it easier for you to replace them if you're a building owner and you have some of these on the shelf for your space and you need to replace one in a duct. It's quite easy to do. Same technology. They are sealed, obviously. It's a silicone gasket that seals around the circuit board, preventing moisture from getting into the electrical circuit. These detectors have a built-in drift compensation, which means they're basically always calibrating themselves to a baseline through a software algorithm in the detector itself. So it works kind of like some of the CO2 sensors we've used over the years, where they figure out what their baseline value is and then constantly recalibrate themselves to that, which prevents small nuisance trips over time. So it's only going to alarm if there's a substantial amount of smoke and not a little bit of drift or something like that, or something due to dirt or something of that nature. This is not necessarily new technology. This has been around for a few years. System Sensor has over 6 million of these units, or at least as of 2008 had 6 million. By now I'm sure they're up to 10 million. There's quite a few of them out in the field, so it's a very proven technology. Testing these guys can be done several different ways. You can test it with a magnet, which is a very common way for most manufacturers to test them. Obviously, it only tests the electrical circuitry. It doesn't test the smoke detector head itself. It just tests to see if you have a complete electrical connection and your air handler shuts down like you expect and your alarms go off like you expect and all that good stuff. You can also test it with a test button that's on the front of the plastic, so you can do it that way. And if you have a remote accessory station, you can test it that way. And then, of course, if you want to test the full functionality, you'd have to do it with a smoke test in the duct to actually test the detector head itself. This here shows one of the new system sensor wall products. This is an alarm/testing station. It has a strobe light built into it, has a horn built into it, it has a key switch, and it has a test button. This guy can also handle 2 detectors. So if you had that situation where you're required to put a supply and return on the same air handler, this guy could be wired to both of them to test both. There's a sensitivity measurement tester that you can use with it. This is probably more for the fire life safety guys and less for the mechanical contractor world, but it is available. If you're using that test station, you can take this tester and put it right up to the front of it, put the key switch on the one you want to test, and then it'll read back to you the sensitivity level on the digital readout of the detector itself. So it does it via communication. There are numerous remote test stations and alerting stations available for these products, like with most manufacturers. So for example, if I just have the need to have a remote indicator, this bottom left one has an indicator light on it that can tell me if I have a problem with my detector. The top one has 2 indicator lights on it, so I can have one that says, do I have good power and or do I have a problem? There's one with key switches to put them into a test mode so the firemen can do that. There's ones with LED lights and horns on them. There's ones with just horns. They come available in white or in red, depending on what you're trying to do. And then there's the the full one I just showed you with the strobe light and the horn and the test station and the key. So everything in one. We stock smoke detectors. We stock sampling tubes. We typically don't stock remote test stations unless somebody has a specific project coming up, because there's so many flavors of them, and it's at the discretion of the fire department for each community on what they want. And it's very difficult to stock, a one-size-fits-all, because they always want different things. But we can get them in a matter of a couple days for you. Most of these detectors operate from -4 to 158 degrees Fahrenheit. There is a version that goes down to -40 if you have that application, but typically -4 is sufficient in our market. The other cool thing about System Sensor, other than some of these accessories and how easy it is to install the sampling tubes and the flexible rectangular or square design, the other cool thing is that it can handle low velocities, as low as 100 feet per minute. I believe it is the lowest velocity that any manufacturer can handle. So if you have an application with a rooftop or something like that, life is good. You don't have to worry about it. But if you have some specialty systems and you have low air velocity, this guy can handle that down to 100 feet per minute. All right, so there's different ways to do this here. What I'm showing here is a regular detector that we would supply to you. Detector's on the left side, the electrical circuitry is on the right-hand side. You can flip it into a square or rectangular mode. However, if you need 2 detectors, one for supply, one for return, instead of buying 2 detectors and then trying to figure out how to wire them together to interlock them, you can actually just use the one detector and then buy just a second sensor head and wire that head back to the exact same power circuit board as this guy. So A, it saves cost because you're only buying one power and control board, but B, it also simplifies the wiring. So mount this guy on the return or the supply and mount this guy on the other duct. The other way to do it is you can not buy a regular detector and you could buy 2 of the heads and buy 1 control board. This would be useful if you want to mount the control board in the rooftop control section instead of actually out in the duct. So you can have 1 detector in the supply, 1 detector in the return, both of them wired back to the central control panel, which is inside the actual rooftop electrical panel. So you can do it that way as well. And this just shows an example of what I'm talking about here. This shows a combined piece on the return duct with the detector and the control board, and then it shows a second detector head for the supply air. Well, both of them wired together here, and then obviously just the return air one wired back to the actual fan itself. So instead of wiring both of them back to the fan, you only have to wire one of them back to the fan, but you do have to wire them to each other. But it simplifies things, it allows you to share accessories and stuff like that. You can interlock these detectors to each other. So if I have, say, 5 air handlers in a space and one of them goes into smoke alarm, maybe I want to shut down all 5 of them, I can definitely do that with interlock wiring, and I can interlock up to 50 of these guys off of each other. So one of them can shut down all 50, and then obviously you can see which one is an alarm by going to its associated remote test station or by looking at the detectors on the duct themselves and see which one has the alarm light on. So it should be easy to figure out which one actually went into alarm and not have to check all 50 of them. Like I said, these guys can handle pretty low flow, and the way they do that, this is the detector head itself. On the left side is the supply air sampling tube connection. On the right side is that exhaust connection going back into the duct. So it draws air through the supply, across the head of the detector, and then back into the return duct. And you can see the plastic has been formed here to shrink down, to reduce, which will increase our velocity. to give us a higher velocity actually through the detector itself. So that's one of the ways we can get low velocity air systems to be detected by the standard detector. There's not a lot to configure on these guys. There's a few dip switches on there. There's a dip switch to tell it, do I have 1 or 2 detectors on this air handler? Do I have a supply and return, or do I just have 1? There is a dip switch so I can decide if I want my auxiliary relay to not switch or if I want it to switch. And then I have one for tamper delay. By default, there's a 7-minute delay on the cover of these detectors. You can take the cover off, do some work in the detector, and put it back on, and it will not alarm out and shut all the air handlers off unless you did that for more than 7 minutes. Sometimes inspectors don't like that. I mean, it's nice because it avoids nuisance alarms if someone's working on the system, but sometimes inspectors don't like that, and if the cover comes off, they want it to immediately alarm, so you can go ahead and change that to 0 minutes. The front of the plastic is nice because it's clear, so I can see what's going on, with the exception of the watertight one. You can't see through that one, but the normal detector is clear. You can see what's going on. You can see the sensor lights on it. You can access the remote test button, which is this black button here, from outside the plastic cover, so you don't have to take the cover off even to do a test, which is very helpful. The way the part numbers work, basically if it's a duct smoke detector, it starts with a D. Remember, System Sensor does make ceiling and wall devices, so D is for duct, which is what we're concerned with in the HVAC world. The next digit is whether you have a 2 or 4 wire. Almost everything nowadays is going to be a 4-wire detector, and that's the one we're stocking for the interlock wiring between these guys. If you have an S, it's a sensor-only board. If you have a P, it's a power-only board. If you have nothing, then it's a traditional detector, which has the sensor and the power combined, like I showed you before. If it says 120, it's 120 volt. If it says nothing in that spot, it's 24 volt. If it says W, it's the outdoor NEMA 4 watertight version. If it doesn't say W, it's just a regular smoke detector. Like I said, these guys do replace the old System Sensor product line. So on the left side is the new Flex model numbers. So D4120 is your everyday workhorse. D4120W is your watertight version. Here's your sampling tubes down here. DST5, a 5-foot sampling tube, would be your most common. And on the right-hand side, the right column, it tells you what it replaces. It's the old System Sensor model numbers. And like I said, unfortunately, the sampling tubes are not compatible between the two, really. So you would need a new sampling tube if you buy a new detector. But some of the accessories are directly compatible. All right, so that kind of concludes the System Sensor webinar for this week. I thank you for joining us. I'd also like to mention that next Monday, we'll be talking about Sierra Dedicated Outdoor Air Systems, DOAS units, 100% outside air, packaged heating and cooling units. Sierra also makes, in addition to packaged heating and cooling units, which is what we mainly use them for, they also make direct-fired and indirect-fired heating-only makeup air units, and they make direct and indirect evaporative cooling units, which evaporative cooling is not hugely popular in Illinois, unlike Arizona or something like that. But there are facilities where it makes sense, manufacturing, warehouse facilities, but we could talk about those if you have applications for them. This is our webinar schedule for the entire year. Most of you know by now, every Monday at noon Central Time, we do a webinar. And like I said, this week was System Sensor. Next week is Sierra Dedicated Outdoor Air Units. There's no webinar on May 31st, holiday. And then on June 7th, we pick it back up again with Carrier water source heat pumps. If you need some specialized training, we have a hands-on training lab in Melrose Park. We also have 6 regular classroom training centers throughout the Chicagoland area, as well as our Minnesota and Kansas City locations. We have a mobile truck that we take out to do training classes on-site with people so we can demonstrate equipment that way. We have over 200 training classes a year that we do. We can definitely help you out with training. Just give me a call and let me know. If you have any questions about System Sensor, ducts, smoke detectors, or training in general, please give me a call, 708-670-6383, or send me an email, which you see up on the screen there. I thank you very much for your time today, and have a good day.